And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much.
The moment the court's decision was read, the room seemed to lose its air. King Charles did not speak. He did not argue. He simply stared at the ruling that changed everything. Sandringham, the estate wrapped in royal memory, private grief, family tradition, and sovereign power, was no longer his to command in one devastating judgment. Princess and had inherited Sandringham fully, and the monarchy felt the ground shift beneath it. Charles sat frozen as the document landed before him, the court ruling a formal legal decision that settles authority over a disputed matter carried the weight of a sentence. It said plainly that, and now inherited Sandringham fully, not partly, not symbolically, not under his supervision. Sandringham was not just another royal property. It was the private Norfolk home, where Christmas mornings, family talks, and the late Queen's memories became legend. To lose command was to lose control over his mother's shadow. And did not celebrate. She read the same words with a steady face, but her silence carried pain. The princess understood that this inheritance was not a prize. It was a duty wrapped in loyalty, tied to the monarch who had trusted her when no one else knew what had been sealed away. The sealed estate instructions, private written directions left to guide a family property's future, had stayed hidden from most of the household until the final legal review. Now those instructions spoke louder than rank. Camilla watched the change settle over the room. She had expected Sandringham to remain within Charles's direct household authority, with every tradition flowing through the king's wishes. Instead, the queen consort saw a future narrowing in front of her. No one raised a voice. The shock was already there in the way Charles tightened his fingers around the page, then set it down, as if touching it longer would deepen the wound, and looked toward her brother. And for 1 second the ruling felt less like law and more like betrayal. Charles felt the same pain from the other side. The king had inherited a crown, and had inherited the house of memory beneath that decision was one question no one could escape. Why had the late queen chosen her daughter for Sandringham, and what private incident had pushed her to make that choice? Before the court ever spoke, but before the family could understand why, and had been given everything, they had to face the painful truth of who stood to lose the most. Every royal crisis has a public face, but this one had private wounds hidden behind polished doors. Charles saw Sandringham as part of his birthright, and saw it as a duty, and trusted in silence. William saw a dangerous fracture forming, and Camilla saw a future suddenly rewritten. What looked like an inheritance dispute was really a family reckoning, and each person walked into it carrying a different fear. Charles could not separate Sandringham from the memory of his mother. To him, the estate was not just land, rooms, gates, or old tradition. It was continuity. It was Christmas mornings under the weight of royal expectation. It was the place where private family life and sovereign duty had always met. He had believed with quiet certainty that Sandringham would remain under his natural authority, because the crown had passed to him, and because so much of his life had been shaped by waiting for that moment. But now the court papers in his hand told a colder story. The crown was his, the estate was Anne's. William watched his father near the closed window and understood the danger. At once Charles was not simply disappointed, he was wounded in the part of him that still needed his mother's trust. The prince could see the monarch fighting to stay composed, his grip tightening around the ruling as if strength alone could change the words. William knew that if his father turned, that hurt toward, and the family could split into silent camps, not publicly, not loudly, but in the way doors closed, calls went unanswered, and loyalty became careful instead of natural, and carried her victory like a burden. She had not asked for spectacle, and she did not want the world to see her as the sister who had taken something from the king. To her, the ruling was not a gift of privilege, it was a command from the past. The late queen had trusted her with Sandringham's future, and that trust now demanded obedience. Yet beneath her calm was a fear she would never easily admit. Accepting the estate fully might force her into open conflict with the brother she had protected, defended, and stood beside for decades. Camilla sat apart after hearing the news, her expression fixed in silence. She understood the meaning immediately. Her influence over Sandringham's future had vanished. Guest arrangements, family traditions, private authority, all of it now moved beyond her reach. And as the room absorbed that truth, one darker question began to rise. Why had the late queen made such a final choice? And the deeper they looked into the past, the clearer it became that Sandringham had been quietly removed from Charles's future long before the court ever spoke. The ruling did not begin in court. It began years earlier behind closed doors on a Christmas Eve, when one private conversation at Sandringham changed the fate of the estate forever. The family remembered the dinner, the aides remembered the silence afterward, but only a few understood what truly happened that night, when the late Queen watched, listened, and made a decision that would one day devastate her son Charles. Believed the matter had passed like many family disagreements, passed quietly, swallowed by tradition and time, but Sandringham had already become a pressure point inside the family. It was the place where royal habits were protected, where Christmas customs carried the weight of history, and where the late Queen's personal judgment mattered more than anyone's ambition. After her reign, one question began to trouble the household: who would guard Sandringham as a family sanctuary, and who would reshape it into something else? That Christmas Eve became the trigger. During a private gathering, Charles asked for greater future control over household arrangements, guest access, and estate traditions. He spoke as a future king preparing for responsibility, but the Queen heard something different. She heard the risk of personal preference entering a place she believed had to remain above private influence. She listened carefully, and the longer he spoke, the more still she became. Charles thought he was discussing order. His mother understood he was revealing intention, and sensed the shift before anyone named it. After the others had left, the Queen removed her glasses and asked her daughter to remain behind. The request was calm, but it carried a heaviness, and never forgot. The monarch spoke about duty in plain terms. Sandringham, she said, could not become a prize for whoever held the strongest title. It had to be protected by someone willing to say no, even when no would hurt the people closest to them, and listened without interruption. She understood restraint. She understood sacrifice, and in that conversation, the Queen began placing the emotional foundation for what would later become sealed instructions, private directions meant to guide the estate's future. When she was no longer there to defend her wishes herself, Charles never knew how deeply that evening had cut. He believed the disagreement had faded. He believed his mother had moved on, but the past had not moved on. It had been written down, preserved, and waiting. When the court finally recognized those sealed instructions, one Christmas Eve conversation returned with brutal force. What Charles had forgotten and had carried, what began as a quiet Christmas disagreement, now returned as a legal earthquake, and this time Anne and Charles would have to face each other without the protection of silence. There are royal confrontations that happen before cameras, and there are others that wound far more deeply, because no one is there to soften them. When Charles and Anne met after the ruling, there were no aides speaking for them, no quarters arranging the language, no public smiles to hide behind, just a brother, a sister, and the estate that had become the symbol of everything unresolved between them. Charles entered that private room carrying more than court papers. He carried disappointment, pride, and the sharp ache of a son who had discovered too late that his mother had made plans without him. The ruling had already stripped away his assumption of control, but Anne's presence made the loss personal. He looked at his sister and asked the question that had been burning through him since the judgment was read. Had she known, had she understood before anyone else that the court would place Sandringham fully in her hands, and did not step back from the weight of it? She told him she had known only what their mother had trusted her to protect, not what the final judgment would declare. That answer did not comfort Charles. It cut deeper, because to him the issue was no longer simply about Sandringham. It was about being left outside of final confidence, about inheriting the crown while losing access to one of the most intimate pieces of his mother's private world. The king could face parliament duty and public pressure, but this was different. This was family, and heard the hurt in his voice, and it wounded her too. She reminded him that inheritance is not always affection, and control is not always trust. Those words changed the temperature of the room. Charles was not asking like a monarch demanding obedience. He was speaking like a brother who feared he had been judged unworthy, and understood that fear, but she could not surrender to it. The late Queen's instructions had not been written for comfort. They had been written to survive pressure. Charles feared the ruling would diminish him inside his own family. Sandringham now stood beyond his command, and everyone would know it, and answered with the one truth: he could not easily defeat. The court had not chosen her over him. Their mother had, through sealed instructions, through careful wording, through a decision protected from emotion, she had placed the estate where she believed discipline would hold, and in that moment the confrontation exposed something larger than grief. Feelings had shaken the room, but feelings no longer controlled Sandringham. Papers did, trustees did, authority did, and once the siblings stepped out of that room, the question was no longer what they felt, it was who now held the power to decide Sandringham's future. Behind every royal ruling stands a machinery few outsiders ever see, not crowns, not balcony appearances, not ceremony files, trustees' signatures, sealed instructions, and people trained to obey paper over emotion. Charles could be devastated and could be burdened. Camilla could be shaken, but once the estate instructions were activated, Sandringham belonged to a new order, and that order answered to and understood the weight before anyone explained it. The court decision had not simply given her a name on paper, it had given her full inheritance authority over Sandringham, meaning she now held the final say over private estate access, household continuity, and preservation decisions. Every old assumption had been broken, every quiet habit had to be checked. The estate that Charles believed would naturally follow his command now required Anne's approval before its most private routines could continue. The power shifted in silence. Trustees, legal advisors, and estate officials now had to recognize. And as the final controlling figure, trustees are appointed people responsible for protecting property according to legal instructions, and in this case their loyalty was not to emotion, title, or family pressure. Their duty was to the ruling that made the moment even colder for Charles. The king could carry the crown, but at Sandringham and carried the authority that mattered. A senior estate official placed a new authorization file before Anne. The room tightened around that single gesture. She looked down at the first instruction, waiting for her signature. Her hand did not move at once. That pause said everything, and was not savoring victory. She was measuring the cost. One stroke of a pen would confirm the new order, but it would also draw a line between her duty and her brother's expectation. The princess had spent a lifetime standing beside Charles, yet now she had to stand in front of him. Charles's household could no longer issue direct instructions over Sandringham without Anne's approval. That truth moved quickly through private channels, sharper than any public statement. Requests that once passed smoothly now needed review. Decisions once assumed to belong to the king now waited beneath his sister's authority. Camilla's position grew uncertain, as well her expected role in future estate, hosting, guest arrangements, and private household influence had suddenly lost its foundation. And finally signed, but the signature did not feel like an ending. It felt like the first crack in a much larger wall. No speeches were needed, no announcement had to thunder across the palace. The consequences would arrive through quieter blows, names removed from lists, doors reassigned, familiar routines interrupted, and old privileges questioned one by one. And when the first changes reached the royal households, the ruling stopped being a legal decision and became a daily reality. No one could ignore the fallout. Began not with a public statement, but with a door, one familiar door at Sandringham. One staff member standing still, one instruction that could no longer be ignored. For years access had been assumed, movements had been routine, and authority had passed through habit. But after the ruling, habit meant nothing. The estate had changed hands, and the first person to feel it was Camilla. Camilla received the message without raising her voice. Her household had requested access to a private room at Sandringham, a space once treated as part of the normal rhythm of royal movement before the ruling. That request would have passed through familiar channels, quiet and unquestioned. Now it was delayed, not rejected, not approved, delayed pending Anne's authority. That single word carried more force than an argument, because it proved the court's decision had left the page and entered daily life. Staff had no room to soften it. The ruling forced them to follow the new legal authority. Even when the request came from the king's household, every person around Sandringham understood the danger of that shift. To private estate instruction was no longer a distant legal phrase. It was now a command shaping who could enter, who could decide, and whose name carried weight behind closed doors. Camilla heard the explanation in silence, then set her teacup down so sharply that the room fell still. Charles learned of the delay soon after, and humiliation moved through him before anger could take its place. The king understood at once what this meant. Sandringham was not merely outside his full control. In theory, it was now outside his control. In practice, his own household could ask, but Anne's approval would decide. The monarch had spent his life preparing to inherit authority, yet here was one of the most personal parts of royal life, answering to his sister instead, and did not need to make a public display of power. The estate staff were already updating internal protocols, replacing old assumptions with direct authorization from her. Office lists were being checked, access routes were being reviewed. Household routines that once moved by tradition were now being measured against the ruling. Each change was quiet, but each one landed heavily. William saw the danger growing with every small adjustment. He knew that a delayed request, a reassigned room, or a revised access note could feel like an insult if the family refused to accept the truth. Quickly, the prince understood that pride could turn procedure into warfare, and somewhere beneath Charles's embarrassment and Camilla's silence, another meeting became unavoidable. Yet beneath the anger and embarrassment there remained one final private conversation that could either harden the divide or begin to heal. At the turning point came, without witnesses, no advisors, no lawyers, no Camilla, no William, just Charles, and in a quiet room where an empty chair seemed to speak louder than either of them was the chair their mother once used during private family discussions, and for the first time since the ruling, both siblings stopped arguing over Sandringham and began grieving what the decision truly represented. Charles looked at that empty chair longer than he looked at the papers. The anger that had carried him through the first hours after the ruling began to lose its strength. What remained was quieter and far more painful, he admitted to, and that the judgment had made him feel less like a king and more like a son left outside his mother's final trust. The words did not come easily. The monarch had spent a lifetime learning how to hide disappointment behind duty, but this wound had reached a place duty could not fully cover and softened when she heard it. She had expected resistance, maybe even accusation, but not that kind of confession. The princess told him their mother's decision was not designed to wound him. It was designed to protect Sandringham from becoming a battleground, a place where personal wishes, household influence, and royal pressure could slowly change what the late queen had spent decades guarding. That truth did not erase Charles's pain, but it gave it shape. For the first time he saw that Anne had not been handed comfort, she had been handed responsibility. Charles listened, and sadness began to shift into recognition. Sandringham was not merely property, it was memory under pressure. It was a family home carrying the weight of the crown, and whoever controlled it would also carry every accusation that followed and confess that every signature felt like carrying their mother's judgment in public. Each instruction she approved placed her between loyalty to Charles and loyalty to the Queen's final wishes. Her strength had a cost. Her victory had no joy. Charles did not ask her to surrender the estate. He did not challenge her authority again. In that room, that silence became his first step toward acceptance. Not full peace, not easy forgiveness, but acceptance, and understood what that silence meant, and she did not fill it with triumph. The brother and sister had not solved every wound, but they had finally stopped treating each other as opponents. Yet outside those closed doors, the world was already waiting to turn private grief into public spectacle. The family had found a fragile understanding, but the headlines had not, the cameras had not, the public hunger had not. But while Charles and Anne found a fragile understanding behind closed doors, the world outside was already turning Sandringham into the monarchy's most dramatic symbol of change. By morning, Sandringham was no longer just a royal estate. It was the image on every screen, the headline on every desk, and the question moving through Britain with unusual force: how could a king lose control of a place so closely tied to his own family story? The public did not see sealed instructions or private grief. They saw a monarch wounded, a princess elevated, and a dynasty forced to explain itself. The front page landed with the force of a palace alarm. One national newspaper placed Sandringham's gates across its cover beneath the headline, and takes Sandringham king left devastated. Those words did what no official statement could control. They turned a private ruling into a national drama. They made Charles's pain public, they made Anne's authority unavoidable, and they made the monarchy look less like an untouchable institution and more like a family divided by memory, duty, and one mother's final decision. Crowds gathered near Sandringham's gates before the palace could shape the mood. Some stood quietly, as if they were watching history settle over the estate. Others lifted phones, trying to capture the place that had suddenly become the center of the royal storm. The estate had always mattered because it held tradition, Christmas ritual, private family life, and the late queen's emotional presence. Now it mattered for a harsher reason. It had become proof that even a king could be overruled by the instructions left behind. Broadcasters seized the story with unusual urgency. They did not frame it as a simple inheritance matter. They called it a historic private family transfer of power, a phrase that carried danger because it suggested authority had moved inside the monarchy without public ceremony or royal consent. William watched the coverage with a tense expression, knowing sympathy for Charles could deepen the humiliation rather than soften it. The prince understood that public pity can wound a monarch almost as sharply as public criticism and refused to celebrate her message was restrained, careful, and built around duty, continuity, and respect for the late queen's wishes. She did not call it a victory. She did not speak as if she had defeated her brother. That restraint protected her, but it also made the ruling feel even more final. Camilla remained absent from the public response, and her silence became its own statement. The queen consort's quiet absence told the country that the decision had reached places no press release could explain. The noise grew louder, but the meaning became clearer. This was not only about land, gates, rooms, or tradition. It was about what kind of monarchy survives when private trust is tested in public. And once the noise faded, the monarchy was left with one final truth. Sandringham had not simply changed hands, it had revealed the emotional cost of inheritance. In the end, the ruling did not destroy the monarchy, it exposed it. It showed that even kings can be overruled by the quiet decisions of those who came before them. It showed that princess and strength was never loud but immovable, and it showed that Sandringham, the estate of family memory, had become the place where duty finally outweighed expectation. Charles returned to the papers one last time, and this time he did not reach for them with anger. He reached for them like a man touching the final proof of a truth he could no longer resist. The court ruling, a legal judgment that decides who holds authority in a dispute, had given and full control of Sandringham. Under the late queen's final instructions, the king remained wounded because the estate carried his childhood, his mother's presence, and the private authority he believed would naturally stay with him. Yet the monarch finally understood that fighting again would not restore what had been lost. It would only turn grief into war, and moved through Sandringham with quiet resolve, and the silence around her no longer felt like victory. The princess knew she had not defeated her brother. She had inherited a sacred responsibility, one built from trust, restraint, and a mother's final judgment. Sandringham mattered because it was not merely a royal residence, it was a private family estate, meaning a home held outside ordinary public ceremony, where traditions, household choices, and emotional history carried deep personal weight, and understood that every decision she made now would be measured against the queen's memory, and that kind of trust could feel heavier than any crown. Camilla absorbed the new reality from a distance. The queen consort did not need a public rejection to understand the boundary. Some parts of royal life would remain beyond her influence, and Sandringham had become the clearest proof of that limit. She had once expected access, presence, and quiet influence to follow the king's household naturally. Now she saw that Anne's authority stood between old expectation and future control. Camilla felt the chill of that change, and her silence showed how deeply it had settled. William read the moment differently from everyone else. The prince saw pain, yes, but he also saw protection. In his view, the ruling preserved Sandringham from emotional bargaining and forced the family to respect boundaries set before them. The future king understood the larger lesson: inheritance is not always about rank, title, or expectation. Sometimes it is about trust placed where discipline is strongest. Charles closed the file slowly and chose not to reopen the fight, and carried the estate fully. Camilla accepted the limit. William understood the warning. The royal family moved forward, changed but not broken. Sandringham became, and Charles's grief became, part of private royal history, and the monarchy survived because it finally accepted what the late queen had decided. Sandringham stayed standing and carried the trust. Charles carried the wound, and the monarchy learned that even the crown must sometimes bow to a mother's final decision.
Yet the monarch finally understood that fighting again would not restore what had been